The clock on the mantle had been ticking in this house for 31 years. I bought it the same week my wife and I moved in, back when the neighborhood still had that new suburb smell, fresh asphalt and cut grass, and the particular optimism of people who believed they were building something permanent. Eleanor picked it out from a shop on Delaney Street. She said the sound would keep the house feeling alive. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. She passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and I have never in my life felt time move both so fast and so unbearably slow as it did during those 11 weeks. After the funeral, my son told me I should sell the house. Too big for one person, he said. Too many memories. He said it with his hand on my shoulder and his eyes full of something I read, at the time, as genuine concern. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. This house was mine and Eleanor's, and I intended to die in it of old age on my own terms, not grief. I am 67 years old. I taught high school history for 34 years at Mercer County High. I coached junior varsity baseball for 22 of those years. I am not a man who confuses sentiment for weakness, and I am not a man who fails to recognize a pattern when he sees one. Those two things matter to what I'm about to tell you. The morning it all unraveled started the way most mornings do. I was up before 6, the way I've been since I was in my 30s and stopped being able to sleep past sunrise. I made coffee the real kind, ground fresh. None of that pod nonsense, and I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper and the quiet. I've come to love the quiet since Eleanor passed. It used to feel like absence. Now it mostly just feels like mine. My phone buzzed at 6:48. A notification from my bank's app. I have the alerts set up so that any transaction over $500 sends me a message. My son helped me set that up about 2 years ago. Actually, he'd said, "Dad, you've got to be careful with scammers targeting people your age." I thought that was thoughtful of him. I thanked him for it. I even told my friend Gerald about it over lunch, told him my son was looking out for me. The notification said that a wire transfer of $14,000 had been initiated from my primary checking account at 6:31 that morning. I set the coffee cup down. I read the notification again. $14,000, initiated at 6:31 a.m. I had not initiated any wire transfer. I had not been awake at 6:31, I'd been in bed until 6:10. And I certainly hadn't touched my laptop or my phone before making coffee. I opened the app itself and looked at the full transaction detail. The transfer was going to an account I didn't recognize. The routing number wasn't one I knew. The memo line said invoice payment, and I have never in my life paid an invoice by wire transfer at 6:30 in the morning. I called the bank's fraud line. I was on hold for 4 minutes, which felt like an hour. When the representative answered, I explained what I was seeing. She put a temporary hold on the transfer, which hadn't fully processed yet, and told me I needed to come into the branch in person with my ID to file a formal dispute and review recent account activity. She said there were other transactions I should see. Other transactions. I asked her how many. She said she couldn't give me specifics over the phone, but she strongly encouraged me to come in as soon as the branch opened at 9. I sat at that kitchen table for the next 2 hours and thought about who had access to my accounts. The answer was supposed to be simple. I had one person listed as an authorized agent on my accounts. I'd added him 8 months ago, after my knee surgery, when I genuinely needed help managing some bills during recovery. I'd thought it was temporary. I'd thought of it as practical, not permanent. I'd thought, and this is the part that still sits in my chest, like a stone, that I could trust my own son. His name is Derek. He's 41 years old. He works in commercial real estate, or at least that's what he tells people. The truth, which I've learned in pieces over the past year, is that his business has been struggling for a long time. His wife, my daughter-in-law, has expensive tastes and a reluctance to adjust them to circumstances. They have a house that's too large for what they can actually afford, and 2 car payments and private school tuition and all the visible architecture of a life that's being held together with debt and performance. I knew some of this. Not all of it. Families have a way of presenting their best face to the people they most want to impress, and I suppose I still wanted to be impressed by my son. Or maybe I just didn't want to see what I was seeing. That's a hard thing to admit when you're 67 years old and you've spent your whole life priding yourself on being clear-eyed. I was at the bank at 9:02. The branch manager, a steady woman named Miss Kaufman, brought me into her office and closed the door. She had a printed account summary already prepared on her desk. She slid it across to me and gave me a moment to look at it before she said anything. The summary showed 11 transactions over a period of 6 weeks. The wire transfer that morning was the largest, but it wasn't the first. There had been 6 ATM withdrawals, 2 online bill payments to accounts I didn't recognize, and 2 previous wire transfers of smaller amounts, $4,000 and $6,200 respectively. The total, across all 11 transactions, was just over $41,000. $41,000. I have spent my entire adult life being careful with money. Eleanor and I lived below our means for decades. We drove modest cars and took modest vacations and put the difference in savings and in this house and in retirement accounts. $41,000 represented nearly 2 years of careful, disciplined saving. I asked Miss Kaufman how these transactions were authorized. She explained that the ATM withdrawals were made with a card linked to the account, a card that had been issued to the authorized agent on the account, which was my son. The wire transfers and online payments had been initiated through the online banking portal, using credentials that had been set up on my account. I asked her who had set up those credentials. She said the account records showed that the authorized agent had assisted in setting up online access from a device that was not mine, approximately 7 months ago, 1 month before my knee surgery, actually, not after. She said it quietly. She was being careful with me. The way you're careful with someone when you're delivering information that's going to change the shape of their life. I appreciated that. I also needed her to keep going. I asked her directly, had any of these transactions been made by me? She said no. The IP addresses, the device signatures, the timing, none of it matched my typical account activity. The bank's fraud detection system had actually flagged 2 of the earlier transactions, but they'd been cleared because the authorized agent had called in to confirm them. He'd called in, using my personal information, my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, the answers to my security questions, and confirmed that the transactions were legitimate. He had called the bank and impersonated me. I sat in that chair and looked at the account summary, and I didn't say anything for what must have been a full minute. Miss Kaufman didn't rush me. Outside her office window, I could see the parking lot filling up, regular people running regular Tuesday morning errands, and I thought about the fact that I had taught my son that there were things in this world you simply did not do. I had taught him that in the classroom and at the dinner table and on the baseball field and in every way I knew how. I thought about Eleanor, who had loved that boy with a fierceness that never wavered, and I thought about what she would have said if she were sitting next to me in that chair. She would have said, "Well, now you know. What are you going to do about it?" I told Miss Kaufman I wanted to file a formal fraud report immediately. I told her I wanted the authorized agent removed from my account. I told her I wanted all online access suspended and new credentials established only in my presence. And then I told her I wanted copies of every transaction record, every IP log, and every phone call record she could provide me, because I intended to take it to the police. She didn't hesitate. She said she would have everything prepared within the hour. While I waited, my son called my cell phone. I looked at the screen for 3 rings and then I answered it. He said good morning, asked how I was doing. His voice had that slightly too casual quality it gets when he's managing something. I've known that voice since he was 16 years old and coming home late from places he wasn't supposed to be. I told him I was at the bank. There was a pause. Just a beat, maybe half a second. but I've spent 34 years reading the silences of people trying to figure out how much someone else knows." He said, "Oh, just handling something?" I said, "Yes, just handling something." He said that was great. Let him know if I needed anything. He was thinking about stopping by for dinner sometime this week. He said his wife had been asking about me. He said maybe Thursday. I said maybe Thursday sounded fine. I hung up. My hands were completely steady. I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes people imagine that moments like this are shaky and tearful in real time. They might be, later. In the moment, I was just a man with a task in front of him and the discipline to complete it. The police report took most of the afternoon. The detective who handled it, a thorough man named Garrison, walked me through every transaction with the bank documents in front of us. He explained that what I was describing, an authorized agent using their position to conduct unauthorized transactions, combined with impersonating the account holder over the phone, constituted multiple counts of bank fraud and identity theft. He said the impersonation calls alone were potentially federal charges. He said he was going to refer the case to the Financial Crimes Unit. He asked me if I had any documentation of when and why I'd added my son as authorized agent on the account. I had it. I'd kept the original paperwork in a folder in my filing cabinet, the way I keep everything. He made copies. He also asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He asked if my son had access to my home. He had a key. Of course he had a key. He'd had a key since Eleanor passed, because we'd thought that was sensible. Family should be able to get in an emergency. That's what we'd told ourselves. I went home that evening, and I called a locksmith before I even took off my coat. New deadbolt and a new handle lock. Installed within 2 hours. I stood in my own kitchen and listened to the locksmith work, and I thought about the fact that I was 67 years old and I was changing the locks on my own house to keep out my own son. Then I thought about Eleanor saying, "Well, now you know." I did not call my son to tell him about the locks. I did not call him that night or the next day. I let him text me about Thursday dinner and I said, "Sure, come by at 6, I'll make something." I was not going to give him the opportunity to prepare a story or move money or involve a lawyer before I was ready. My own attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale who had handled Eleanor's estate, met with me Wednesday morning. I laid out every document on her conference table, and she went through them carefully and methodically. She told me the case was strong. She told me that between the bank records, the IP logs, the phone recordings, and the transaction history, this was not a situation where my son could plausibly claim a misunderstanding. The amounts were too large, the pattern too deliberate, the impersonation calls too explicit. She also pointed out something that I hadn't fully considered. Among the transactions, 2 of the online bill payments had gone to accounts associated with a credit card in my son's wife's name. Not my son's name, his wife's, which meant my daughter-in-law had likely known, may have been directing it. I went home and I cooked dinner on Thursday. My son arrived at 6:05. His wife hadn't come. He said she had a headache, which I believe was a decision they made together once he told her I'd been at the bank. He brought a bottle of wine. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly too nice for a weeknight dinner at his father's house. The kind of thing you wear when you're trying to look casual, but you've been thinking about the impression you're making. We ate at the kitchen table where I've eaten 10,000 meals in this house. I made pot roast, the same recipe Eleanor always used, because I still know how and I saw no reason to change my habits for this particular evening. We talked about the weather and about a baseball player we both follow, and about whether the county was going to repave the road at the end of my street. After dinner, when I'd poured coffee, I put a manila envelope on the table between us. I told him to open it. He looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He said, "What's this?" I told him to open it. He picked it up and unsealed it slowly, the way you open something when you already know it's going to be bad. Inside were copies of the bank statements, the transaction logs, the fraud report, and Miss Kaufman's written summary. He stared at the first page for a long time. I asked him to explain it to me. He started with the version I expected. He said there must be some mistake. He said he'd been helping me with bills. He said I had sometimes been confused about what I'd authorized, that my memory wasn't what it used to be since the surgery, that he was just doing what I'd asked him to do. I let him finish. Then I told him I had the phone recordings from the bank, the calls where he'd used my date of birth and my security questions to confirm transactions while claiming to be me. I told him I had the IP logs showing the transfers were initiated from his home network. I told him about the credit card payments to his wife's accounts. I told him that Detective Garrison had opened a financial crimes investigation and that Patricia Hale was my attorney of record. I told him that I was not confused, that I had not been confused, that I was 67 years old and I had been reading people for 40 years, and I knew exactly what he had done, and I knew exactly what I intended to do about it, he cried. I want to include that because it was real, the tears were real, the shaking hands were real, and I want to say that it didn't move me the way he needed it to, not because I am a cold man, but because I have been a father for 41 years, and I know the difference between remorse and the performance of remorse when consequences have arrived. He was sorry that he was caught. He was sorry that the weight of what he'd done was sitting across the kitchen table from him with documentation. He was not sorry for the 6 weeks of transactions, the phone calls to the bank, the $14,000 transfer that I'd caught at 6:48 inches the morning. He asked me if we could handle this in the family. I told him that $41,000 of my money was no longer in my family. It was in his accounts and his wife's credit card and wherever else it had gone. I told him that the time to handle things in the family was before he started making phone calls impersonating me. He left at 8:20. I watched his car pull out of the driveway and I stood at the kitchen window, and I didn't feel the things I imagine people expect a father to feel in that moment. Mostly I felt clear, clean, almost. Like the difference between knowing something is wrong and having it confirmed is its own kind of relief, even when the confirmation costs you. The investigation moved over the next several months with the particular slow deliberateness of the legal system. There were interviews and subpoenas and a great deal of paperwork that Patricia Hale handled with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. My daughter-in-law retained her own attorney. My son retained a different one. This detail separate attorneys told me something about the state of their marriage that I didn't have the energy to process at the time. The Financial Crimes Unit determined that the total amount taken was $41,840. They also found that my son had attempted, 3 months before I caught him, to change the beneficiary designation on one of my retirement accounts to himself. The change had been rejected by the account custodian because it required a notarized signature, and he hadn't been able to replicate that. I didn't know about the attempt until the investigation uncovered it. That one took me a few days to sit with. My son pled guilty to 2 counts of bank fraud and 1 count of identity theft. His wife pled guilty to 1 count of receiving fraudulent proceeds. The sentencing came on a Thursday in November, 14 months after that notification on my phone at 6:48 inches the morning. My son was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. His wife received 2 years of probation and was ordered to repay her portion of the funds. Restitution for the full $41,840 was ordered against both of them jointly. I was present for the sentencing. I sat in the gallery and I listened to the judge, and I did not look at my son's face when the sentence was read, not because I was afraid of what I'd feel, but because there was simply nothing left in me to give that moment. I had already grieved it, quietly, at the kitchen table and on early morning walks, and over the course of 34 years of trying to build something worth being proud of. I want to tell you something about the months since the sentencing, because I think it matters. I still live in this house. I still make coffee fresh in the morning and read the newspaper and let the clock on the mantel do what Eleanor always said it would do, which is keep the house feeling alive. My knee is fine. I teach a twice-weekly history seminar at the public library, now nothing formal, just a group of interested adults who like to talk about things that happened before they were born. I have friends. I have Gerald, who checks in regularly and who was, incidentally, the first person I told about what had happened, sitting across from him at the same lunch counter where I'd once proudly told him my son had helped me set up bank alerts. I have not spoken to my son since the day he left my house. I have not spoken to my daughter-in-law. I don't know if I will. I haven't decided yet, and I think not deciding is its own kind of answer. What I will tell you is this. People said things to me throughout this process, well-meaning people. People who love me, and the thing they said most often was some version of, "I can't imagine how you're managing," usually said with a tilted head and lowered voice. The way people speak to someone they've decided is fragile. I understand where that comes from. I am 67 years old and I live alone, and my son is in federal prison for stealing from me. I understand why that picture looks like devastation, but I want to be honest with you about what it actually feels like from the inside. It feels like I know who I am. I know what I built over 67 years, and I know that no amount of money taken from an account and no act of betrayal by someone I love changes what I built. Eleanor and I built this life together. We built it carefully and honestly and with the full weight of our attention. No one can take that. Not from an account, not from a filing cabinet, not at 6:31 inches the morning while I was still asleep. I am still here. I make my coffee. I open my newspaper. The clock on the mantel ticks the same way it has for 31 years. Some mornings I sit at this kitchen table and I think about the version of my son I raised, the boy who played third base badly but with remarkable enthusiasm, who once cried at a movie and then denied it for 20 years, who stood at his mother's funeral and held himself together with a kind of dignity that made me proud in spite of my grief. I don't know what happened to that boy. I don't know at what point the distance between who he was and what he became got too wide to cross. I suppose I'll be working out the answer to that for the rest of my life. What I know is this. I noticed. I paid attention. I had the presence of mind to look at a notification on my phone at 6:48 inches the morning and understand what it meant and act on it immediately. With clear eyes and steady hands and 34 years of knowing how to read a situation. I am not a fragile old man waiting to be managed. I am a person with a history and a house and a clock on the mantle, and I intend to be exactly that for as long as I have left. The morning after the sentencing, I woke up before 6, the way I always do. I made my coffee. I sat at the table. The light came through the blinds the way it always does, and the clock made its sound, and the house was mine, the way it has always been, the way I always intended it to remain. I opened my banking app. All clear. I put the phone face down on the table, and I finished my coffee, and I thought about Eleanor, and I thought, well, I handled it.